We're joined once again today by Bill Scher, who is a senior writer at Campaign for America's Future. And Bill is here, not so much, Bill, to do an analysis of the candidates who won per se, but more to talk about what a lot of my audience has been emailing in about, which is the seeming discrepancy between the candidates that were elected on the Republican side last week and how their views seem to differ drastically from the views of the voters who voted for them on particular issues. And this ranges from the minimum wage, like we saw with Tom Cotton, to Obamacare, as we saw with so many of these newly elected Republicans who ran on the completely impractical position of repealing Obamacare, but regardless, something that people agree with on the tenets, on its content. Broadly speaking, do you see this discrepancy?
Well, I think the Republicans did a better job in 2014 at blurring a lot of these distinctions and taking away the Democratic advantage in some of these areas. Take Obamacare, for example. In some of the more conservative areas, you saw the same old repeal Obamacare message, but in a lot of other areas, that was much more muted. Take Kentucky, where the state Obamacare exchange is not called Obamacare, it's called KYNet, and it's very popular. Mitch McConnell had to run on, oh, don't worry, no matter what we do in Washington, we're going to keep the state health insurance exchange.
Right.
Which was a farcical if you know the details of the bill, but to the average voter who doesn't follow these things as closely, that was a reassuring message. On other issues, like, say, on reproductive freedom issues, Cory Gardner in Colorado was getting pummeled from Mark Udall for being anti-abortion, anti-birth control. Well, Cory Gardner just said that he's for birth control and took that off the table. Whereas, and some people mocked Udall for being having a single issue attack campaign. But in Michigan, Gary Peters won with a big gender gap in his favor because he ran the same kind of campaign against the Republican candidate Terry Lynn Land, and she did not recalibrate her views. So it's that blurring of the distinctions that Republicans did this time, as opposed to, say, 2012 with Todd Akin or 2010 with Christine O'Donnell, that they did not do.
Well, let me run one hypothesis by you that was sent in to me by a viewer of our show named Kurt, who said, from his anecdotal experience talking to voters that he knows in Georgia, people seem to overstate their conservatism in this kind of amorphous, hypothetical way in their minds. And I've had the same experience talking to people where you say, well, who did you vote for? And someone will say, oh, I voted for the Republican candidate. And you say, why? They say, well, because I'm conservative. And then you say, really, let's talk about the issues. As you start to get these people to talk about their specific views on issues, it turns out they're not conservative. They just seem to think that they are.
Well, there's a certain tribal loyalty, I think, on both sides of the coin, where you feel generally more comfortable with your party. And you don't necessarily dig that deep into the policy specifics. And as we talked about on a past show, the whole 2014 map was skewed to the red. You had a lot of red state Democrats defending seats, or purple state Democrats in seats that Romney had won in 2012. And that made things very hard. So those tribal loyalties were very hard to dislodge. There's some hope that perhaps Democrats could pull off a turnout miracle and defy the prognosticators as they did in 2012 with micro-targeting technology and a beefed up get out of the vote force on the ground. But that proved not to be true in these redder states where I think the tribal loyalties were triumphant.
Yeah, and I think the fact that tribal loyalties exist on both sides is without question, but there's what I see as a very clear trend that for a long time now, people want to understate their progressivism or their liberalism. You hear very commonly, I'm not really this far left person. And on the left, I see this understatement of how progressive one is. But on the right, it seems to be quite the opposite. The idea of being, oh, I'm not really that conservative is not as common of a refrain from Republican candidates as I see it from progressive candidates.
Well, I think you saw it a little bit more so this time around. Cory Gardner is sort of the most dramatic example. I mean, he flat out ran on, I'm a different kind of Republican.
Yeah.
You saw other cases where say in Arkansas, Tom Cotton or Dan Sullivan in Alaska, where there were state ballot initiatives to raise the minimum wage, and they had to embrace those initiatives, even though they were railing against Obama's proposal for a higher federal minimum wage. Dan Sullivan in Alaska said that he took on Wall Street. They weren't necessarily running on. You didn't see a lot of vote for Republican Tom Cotton or vote for Republican Dan Sullivan. They didn't think that the brand name of Republicans was their ticket to success. They instead, they attacked the Democrat for voting with Obama X% of the time, but then would talk about how they would be independent. Tom Tillis, North Carolina, did this. I'm gonna put Carolina first and not party. So they realize that the Republican brand is still very damaged, even in red states. They are able to pivot a little bit better and mask that in a way they hadn't in past elections.
So in thinking about the next couple of years and the lead up to the 2016 election, as you and I have talked about before, and we've talked about it on the show many times, the set of candidates, the set of races that were to be decided this year heavily favored Republicans. Will that be different enough in 2016 that you don't think Democrats need to put into place some kind of significant strategy shift? Or do you think that in spite of a more favorable map in 2016, a more favorable set of election campaigns, that progressives really need to do something differently in the next 2 years?
Well, we know the 2016 map is more favorable. We know who's up for re-election in the Senate. You have a lot of blue state Republicans as opposed to this time we had a lot of red state Democrats. And we know that in a presidential year, these unlikely voters, young voters, unmarried women, people of color, they have shown to be more likely to turn out in those presidential years than in a midterm. So we know that's in place. What we don't know is what the backdrop's going to be. How does the economy look in 2016? How does the foreign policy landscape look in 2016? How have the Republicans in control of Congress, how have they behaved in the past 2 years? Did they prove they're serious about governing, or have they been doubly as dysfunctional as they have been the last 2 years? You have to know those things before you can decide what the specific strategy is going to be. Although obviously, I think it would behoove Democrats to have their own agenda. I don't think it makes sense to be an empty party. Republicans did that this time around. They were a party of no agenda, and that works well enough in a midterm year if you're not too badly called on it. But it's a big risk once you do win and you actually have to govern. Then they're not really in a position to govern right now. In a presidential year, it's much harder to run on an empty platform. So they need to think about. People are with them in general. They don't want to they don't want to see the party of the 1% be in charge. They want to see a party that fights the middle class. There is a skepticism that Democrats can deliver, which Republicans have abetted by blocking everything. But it still puts the onus on Democrats to say, here's what we would do. Here are our ideas that are actually going to make a big difference. And I think there are certain things like raise the minimum wage, which are popular and they should not abandon. But I think people are skeptical that is sufficient to actually solve the problems of slow job growth and stagnating incomes.
Well, what's amazing to me about that is that you have a contingent on the right that believes that just reducing the debt and deficit is going to solve those problems, which we know from talking to actual economists is not the case. For whatever reason, you have a contingent on the right that continues to tout that notion.
Well, what's doubly nuts, because number one, the deficit is down. It's down dramatically over the past 5 years. And they just sort of ignored that, going into the election.
Yeah.
And so it's actually proven that as good as that might be for your long-term fiscal health, it doesn't automatically improve things economically for people in the now. So there's that issue for them. And two, again, they're in the spotlight now. They're on center stage. They claim they're going to be better for the economy and get things done. Now they have to prove it, and they lack an actual policy agenda to execute on that concept. So I think they're gonna be in a weak spot in 2016 no matter what. Democrats need to be able to take advantage of that with a very robust agenda that people say, yes, I feel like this would work if we actually give these guys full control of the levers of power in Washington. Maybe people will be more disabused that there's something magical about divided government that would make things better. People might say in 2016, you know what, we actually need one party in charge to actually do the things they say they're going to do, and this party has a better plan on how to do it.
Well, I hope that we start hearing about what that cohesive plan is going to be from Democrats and not a month before the election. But we're, of course, going to continue following it. We've been speaking with Bill Scher. He is senior writer at Campaign for America's Future. Thanks as always, Bill.
Thank you.